They left her in the Sahara with nothing but the clothes on her back, no water, no supplies, no way to call for help. It was supposed to be a lesson, a way to break the rebellious medic who questioned every order. But what the Delta Force instructors didn't know was that Isla Martin had spent her childhood surviving storms in the Scottish Highlands with her grandfather, a former SAS operative who taught her one rule: fear is just noise, and noise can't kill you. When the rescue team returned 3 days later expecting to find a broken soldier, they instead found something that would change special operations training forever. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out, subscribe now for more. The desert sun hammered down on forward operating base Viper like an anvil striking steel. At 0530 hours, when most of the base was still wrapped in pre-dawn darkness, Isla Martin was already running her third lap around the perimeter, her breath steady despite the punishing heat that would arrive within hours. She was 23 years old, stood 5 feet 3 inches tall, and weighed barely 115 pounds. Her auburn hair was always pulled back in a regulation bun so tight it made her temples ache, and her green eyes held an intensity that made people uncomfortable. In a unit full of operators who averaged 6 feet and 200 pounds of muscle, Isla looked like someone's younger sister who'd wandered into the wrong cafeteria. But appearance and reality rarely aligned in the desert. Isla had been assigned to Delta Force's medical support unit for 11 months, and in that time, she'd become the soldier everyone relied on but nobody respected. She could perform field surgery in conditions that would make civilian doctors quit medicine. She could identify obscure poisons and treat exotic infections. She spoke 4 languages fluently and could read tactical situations with an intuition that bordered on precognition. Yet when mission assignments came down, Isla was always left behind. The morning briefing started at 0600 in the operations center, a climate-controlled bunker that smelled of stale coffee and electronic equipment. Commander Hayes Thornton stood at the front, his square jaw and silver temples giving him the appearance of someone who'd walked straight out of a recruitment poster. Maps of the Syrian border region covered the screens behind him, satellite imagery showing compounds and supply routes marked in various colors. Isla slipped into her usual position near the side wall, her medical pack already prepared for whatever mission would inevitably exclude her. Around the room, Delta operators lounged in their chairs with the casual confidence of men who knew they were the best at what they did. These were soldiers who could breach buildings, neutralize threats, and disappear into hostile territory like ghosts. "Gentlemen," Commander Thornton began, his voice carrying the gravelly authority of 30 years in special operations. "We've received intelligence about a high-value target in the Al-Tanf region. This is a surgical strike. Get in, extract the target, get out before local hostiles can coordinate a response." Isla's pen moved across her notebook, sketching the compound layout from memory of the satellite images she'd studied the night before. She'd made it a habit to review every piece of intelligence that passed through the base, regardless of whether it related to her official duties. Knowledge was armor, her grandfather used to say, and the desert was full of people who wanted you dead. "Patterson, your team leader," Thornton continued, pointing to a thick-necked operator with a scar across his left cheek. "Take Reeves, Donovan, and Kim. You'll insert via helicopter at 2,300 hours, establish overwatch positions here and here." His pointer tapped the screen. "Medical support will be provided by, let's see." He glanced at his roster. "Martin, you're on standby at the landing zone. If anyone needs immediate treatment, you'll have the field station prepped and ready. Stand by at the landing zone." Again. Isla's jaw tightened, but she nodded. Around her, the selected operators were already discussing approach angles and extraction protocols, their voices overlapping with technical jargon and dark humor. None of them looked at her. To them, she was simply part of the equipment, no different from the medical supplies they might need to use. After the briefing dissolved, Isla made her way to the medical bay to prepare her equipment. The room was spotless, every instrument precisely organized, every medication properly stored and labeled. She took pride in the order she maintained, even if nobody noticed. "Heard you're on babysitting duty again." The voice came from behind her. Isla turned to find Dr. Vincent Laurent, the senior field surgeon, leaning against the doorframe with a sympathetic expression. He was French, 40-something, and one of the few people on base who treated her like a colleague rather than a liability. "Standby isn't babysitting," Isla replied, checking the seals on her trauma supplies. "Someone needs to maintain the field station." "Someone, yes. But not necessarily you." Vincent stepped into the room, his voice dropping. "I've read your file, Isla. You were top of your class at combat medicine school. You scored higher on tactical assessments than most of the operators out there. So why do they keep you here counting bandages while less qualified medics get to run missions?" Isla had asked herself the same question countless times. The official answer was always about team dynamics and operational requirements. The unofficial answer was simpler: she didn't look like someone who could keep up in combat. She didn't have the physicality that commanders trusted when rounds started flying. "Because I'm small," she said simply, sealing the equipment case with more force than necessary. "Because when they look at me, they see someone who needs protecting rather than someone who can do the protecting." "That's idiotic," Vincent said flatly. "I've watched you work. You're faster than most of these operators, your endurance is exceptional, and your medical knowledge exceeds that of people twice your age. If they can't see that, they're blind." "Doesn't matter what they can't see," Isla replied, turning back to her preparations. "Only matters what they believe." Vincent was quiet for a moment, then spoke more carefully. "Be patient, Isla. Eventually, they'll have no choice but to recognize your abilities." Isla didn't respond. She'd been patient for 11 months. Patience was beginning to feel like another word for acceptance, and she'd never been good at accepting limitations. The day dragged on with the peculiar slowness that infected every pre-mission period. Isla rechecked her equipment 3 times, reviewed casualty protocols, and studied the mission area until she could navigate it in her sleep. By 1800 hours, when the sun finally began its descent toward the horizon, she'd memorized every possible medical scenario that might arise during the operation. She was eating dinner in the mess hall, alone, as usual, when she overheard a conversation from the next table that made her stomach clench. "I'm just saying," Operator Reeves was explaining to his teammates, "if things go sideways tonight, I don't want to depend on Martin for anything except handing me supplies. She's great at organization, but this isn't a library. She's passed all the same physical requirements we have," Operator Kim pointed out, though his tone suggested he was playing devil's advocate rather than defending her. "Requirements are one thing. Reality is another." Reeves leaned back in his chair, his voice carrying across the mess hall. "When you're carrying 80 pounds of gear through hostile territory, you need people who can match your pace. Martin's tough, I'll give her that. But tough only gets you so far when physics is working against you." Isla set down her fork, her appetite vanishing. She'd heard variations of this conversation before, but it never stopped stinging. The worst part was that she understood their logic. In combat, physical capability mattered. But it wasn't everything. Intelligence mattered. Adaptability mattered. The refusal to quit when everything went to hell mattered. She just never got the chance to prove it. As the operators finished their meal and headed off to final preparations, Isla remained at her table, staring at the half-eaten food on her tray. 11 months of proving herself in every way possible, and she was still just the medic they kept at base camp. The one they called when they needed supplies but never when they needed someone they could trust in the field. The question that had haunted her since arriving at FOB Viper returned with renewed force: how do you prove you're capable when nobody will give you the opportunity to demonstrate your capabilities? The sun was setting over the desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, when Isla made a decision. She walked to the operations center, her mind clear and her resolve hardening with each step. She found Commander Thornton reviewing the mission plan one final time, his face illuminated by the glow of multiple screens. "Sir," she said, standing at attention in the doorway. "I request permission to speak." Thornton glanced up, his expression showing mild surprise. "Martin. What do you need?" "I want to request deployment on tonight's mission." As field medic, not standby support. The commander's eyes narrowed. Your assignment is already determined, Martin. Standby support serves a critical function. A function that could be filled by any of the junior medics, Isla pressed, knowing she was crossing a line but unable to stop herself. Sir, with respect, I'm the most qualified combat medic in this unit. If something goes wrong tonight, wouldn't you want your best asset in position to respond immediately rather than waiting at a landing zone? Thornton's jaw tightened. For a moment, Isla thought he might actually consider her argument. Then his expression hardened into something that looked almost like disappointment. Your confidence is noted, Martin. It's also misplaced. This unit requires soldiers who understand the chain of command and their role within it. Your job is standby support. That's where you'll be tonight. Dismissed. Isla held his gaze for 3 seconds that felt like an hour, then saluted and left the operations center. As she walked back toward her quarters, the desert wind picked up, carrying sand that stung against her face. She'd played by their rules for 11 months. She'd been patient, professional, and perfect in every assigned task. And she was still invisible. Still the soldier they relied on but refused to trust. Still the medic who was good enough to save lives but not good enough to be where those lives might need saving. The mission launched at 2,300 hours as planned. Isla stood at the designated landing zone, her field station prepared and her radio tuned to the operations channel. She listened as the team inserted, established their positions, and began the approach to the target compound. Everything was proceeding according to plan. And Isla Martin stood in the desert darkness, alone with her perfectly organized medical supplies and the growing certainty that patience wasn't a virtue. It was just another word for giving up. The radio chatter from the mission was routine for the first 40 minutes. Isla monitored every transmission while organizing her medical station for the third time, her hands moving through practiced motions while her mind calculated distances, response times, and casualty probabilities that everyone insisted she didn't need to consider. Overwatch 1 in position, came Patterson's voice through her headset, crisp and professional. No movement detected in the target zone. Copy that, Overwatch 1, Commander Thornton responded from the operations center. Breach team, you're clear to advance. Isla traced their movement on the tactical map she'd sketched in her notebook, her photographic memory reconstructing the satellite imagery in precise detail. The team would approach from the northeast, use the compound's blind spot near the generator building, then breach through the secondary entrance. Standard protocol for a surgical extraction. Then, at 2,341 hours, everything changed. Contact. We have contact. Reeves' voice exploded through the radio, the sharp crack of gunfire punctuating his words. Multiple hostiles were pinned down in the courtyard. Patterson's hit, I repeat, Patterson is down. Isla's heart slammed against her ribs as the radio erupted with overlapping voices, situation reports, requests for fire support, urgent calls for medical assistance. She was on her feet instantly, her medical pack already secured, her body moving before her conscious mind caught up. Martin, stay at your position, Commander Thornton's voice cut through the chaos. Breach team, what's Patterson's status? Gunshot wound to the abdomen, Reeves reported, breathing hard. Bleeding is severe. We need immediate medical evac. Negative on evac, Thornton responded. Air support is 30 minutes out. Can you stabilize him? There was a pause filled with more gunfire. Sir, I'm not a medic. I can put pressure on it, but I don't know what the hell I'm doing. He needs a professional. Isla was already calculating. The compound was 8 kilometers from her position. The terrain was rough but navigable on foot. She could cover that distance in 40 minutes if she pushed hard, maybe 35 if she didn't care about having energy left when she arrived. Martin, Thornton's voice carried a warning tone. Do not leave your position. That's a direct order. She stood in the desert darkness, her medical pack feeling like it was burning against her shoulders. 8 kilometers away, a soldier was bleeding out because the team hadn't brought proper medical support. Because they'd assumed everything would go according to plan. Because they'd left the capable medic behind to stand in an empty landing zone. Martin, acknowledge. Isla clicked her radio once, acknowledgement without agreement, then switched it off before Thornton could give another order she didn't intend to follow. She knew exactly what she was about to do, and she knew exactly what consequences would follow. But she also knew that Patterson had maybe 60 minutes before catastrophic blood loss made rescue pointless. She started running. The desert terrain was treacherous in darkness, all hidden rocks and unexpected dips that could snap an ankle if you weren't careful. Isla had spent months jogging this area, had memorized the safest paths through muscle memory and countless hours of studying topographical maps. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her head, "The ground is just another opponent, lass. Learn its patterns, respect its dangers, and it can't hurt you." She maintained a brutal pace, her boots pounding across hard-packed sand, her breathing controlled despite the exertion. The 80-pound medical pack should have been crushing, but Isla had trained with 90 pounds specifically for situations like this. Every morning run that her fellow soldiers mocked as excessive was paying dividends now. The radio in her pack crackled with continued chaos, more gunfire, desperate calls for support, Thornton demanding to know where she was. Isla ignored it all, focusing entirely on the rhythm of her movement. One foot in front of the other. Measure your breathing. Conserve energy for what comes next. At the 15-minute mark, her quadriceps were screaming. At 25 minutes, she felt the familiar burn of lactic acid building in her calves. She pushed through it, drawing on reserves of endurance that came from refusing to accept her body's complaints. Pain was just noise, and noise couldn't kill you. The compound came into view at 32 minutes, a cluster of buildings silhouetted against the star-filled sky, muzzle flashes marking ongoing combat. Isla slowed her approach, moving more carefully now, using the terrain for concealment as she circled toward the breach team's last known position. "This is Martin," she said quietly into her radio, switching it back on. "I'm approaching the compound from the south. What's your status?" The radio exploded. "Martin, what the hell are you doing?" Thornton's voice was fury and disbelief. "You were ordered to maintain position." "Patterson's bleeding out, sir," Isla replied, keeping her voice calm. "With respect, we can discuss my insubordination after I keep your team leader alive." Thornton started, but Operator Kim's voice cut through. "I have visual on someone approaching from the south." "Is that Martin?" "Affirmative," Isla responded, spotting the breach team's position near a crumbling wall. They were pinned down by fire from at least two positions, muzzle flashes coming from a building to the east and a rooftop to the north. "I'm coming in." "Suppressing fire on my mark." "Negative, Martin, you don't have," Reeves began. 3, 2, 1, mark. The operators reacted on instinct, laying down covering fire that forced the hostiles to take cover. Isla sprinted the final 50 meters, her pack bouncing against her shoulders, bullets snapping through the air close enough to feel the displacement. She dove behind the wall next to Patterson, who was conscious but pale, his hands pressed against his abdomen where blood seeped between his fingers. "About time someone competent showed up," Patterson said through gritted teeth, managing a weak smile. "Thought I told you to stay at base camp." "You did." "I don't take orders from bleeding people." Isla was already cutting away his tactical vest, exposing the wound. Gunshot entry point lower left quadrant, no exit wound visible. She felt for his pulse, rapid but present, blood pressure dropping but not critical yet. Reeves stared at her like she'd materialized from thin air. "You ran 8 kilometers? In 30 minutes? With a full med pack?" "Not really the time for a performance review," Isla replied, pulling out trauma supplies. "How many hostiles?" "At least 8, possibly more in the buildings we haven't cleared." Kim kept his weapon trained on the eastern position. "Air support is still 20 minutes out, and we can't extract with Patterson in this condition." "Then I guess we're staying," Isla said, working with practiced efficiency. She established 4 access, started fluid resuscitation, and packed the wound to control bleeding. Her hands moved with absolute confidence, years of training allowing her to work by feel as much as sight in the limited light. Another burst of gunfire made them all duck lower. Isla didn't flinch, continuing her work with steady hands. She'd learned a long time ago that fear was a choice, and she'd chosen not to make it. "Martin," Commander Thornton's voice came through the radio, calmer now but still edged with anger. "Sit rep. Patient is stable for now, but he needs surgical intervention within 4 hours. The wound is serious, possibly involving the spleen or kidney. I've controlled the bleeding and established fluid resuscitation, but he can't stay here indefinitely." "Copy that." Thornton's tone suggested he was recalculating everything he thought he knew about his insubordinate medic. "Air support will extract the team once you're clear of hostile fire." "Roger that, sir. We'll be ready." Isla finished securing Patterson's bandages, then turned to assess the tactical situation. The team was pinned down, air support was still minutes away, and they needed to either eliminate the hostile positions or create enough space for a safe extraction. 30 meters. Her lungs burned from the sprint and the smoke, but she pushed harder, drawing on reserves of endurance that came from refusing to believe in her own limitations. More gunfire, this time close enough that she felt concrete chips sting her face. 40 meters. She could see the generator now, a hulking Soviet-era machine that probably hadn't worked in years but provided perfect cover for the explosive charge. The eastern building's windows were above her, muzzle flashes indicating the hostile positions. She slammed into cover behind the generator, her hands already pulling the charge free. The timer was simple: set it for 30 seconds, arm it, and run like hell. Her fingers worked the mechanism despite the adrenaline making them want to shake. "Charge is set," she called into her radio. 30 seconds, fall back to secondary positions. "Martin, move." Kim's voice was urgent. "You've got hostiles converging on your position." Isla didn't need to be told twice. She activated the timer, heard the mechanism's soft beep, and burst from cover. The return sprint was pure survival instinct, her body operating on autopilot while her conscious mind counted down the seconds. 25. Bullets tracked her movement, kicking up sand in angry geysers. 20. She vaulted over debris she couldn't clearly see, trusting her memory of the terrain. 15. Her legs were screaming, but she'd trained for exactly this kind of punishment. 10. The smoke was clearing, exposing her to increasingly accurate fire. 5. She dove behind the wall where the breach team waited, rolling and coming up in a defensive position. The explosion was massive, a deep concussive blast that shook the ground and turned the eastern building into a cascading collapse of mud, brick and wooden beams. Dust and smoke billowed outward, and the hostile fire from that position ceased instantly. "Building is down," Donovan reported. "Extraction route is clear." Commander Thornton's voice came through, carrying an emotion that might have been respect mixed with fury. "Air support is 2 minutes out. Get to the extraction point. All of you." Part 4. The helicopter's rotors thundered overhead as Isla helped secure Patterson to the stretcher, her hands checking his vitals even as rounds continued to snap from the northern rooftop position. His blood pressure had stabilized, but his color was wrong, too pale, too clammy. They were running out of time. "Extraction bird is taking fire," the pilot's voice crackled through the radio. "I need that rooftop position neutralized or I can't land." Isla looked up at the building where the remaining hostiles had fortified. It was a 2-story structure with exterior stairs leading to the roof access. The tactical problem was simple: someone needed to climb those stairs while under fire, breach the rooftop position, and eliminate the threat. "I'll go," Kim said immediately, but Reeves grabbed his arm. "You're the best shot we have. We need you providing covering fire." Reeves checked his ammunition. "I'll make the run." "Negative," Isla said, already moving toward the stairs. "You're all carrying wounded soldiers' gear plus your own equipment. You're too slow." "I'm going." "Martin, you're a medic, not," Reeves began. "I'm a soldier who happens to have medical training," Isla interrupted, her voice sharp. And right now, this mission needs someone fast more than it needs someone strong. Those stairs are my problem. She didn't wait for permission. The debate about her capabilities could happen later, preferably in a courtroom during her court-martial rather than in a desert while Patterson bled out. The stairs were exposed, a death trap for anyone attempting the climb. But Isla had spent years rock climbing in the Scottish Highlands with her grandfather, scaling cliffs that made these stairs look like a playground jungle gym. She knew how to move fast on vertical surfaces. Covering fire in 3, 2, 1. Kim opened up with precise bursts that forced the hostiles to duck behind their rooftop cover. Isla sprinted for the stairs and began climbing. Not running up them like most soldiers would, but actually climbing, using her hands on the railings to pull herself up faster, taking steps 3 at a time, her smaller frame and lower center of gravity making the aggressive technique possible. Bullets chipped the concrete around her, but she was moving too fast, too unpredictably. At the halfway point, she grabbed a smoke grenade from her belt and threw it onto the rooftop. The explosion of gray smoke bought her precious seconds. She hit the rooftop at full speed, rolling through the smoke and coming up with her sidearm drawn. 2 hostiles were there, temporarily blinded and confused. Her grandfather's voice echoed, "Hesitation is what gets you killed, lass. Commit completely or don't commit at all." She committed. The first hostile went down before he could acquire a target. The second managed to swing his weapon toward her, but Isla was already moving, using the smoke for concealment and her intimate knowledge of rooftop fighting positions. Her second and third shots were center mass, textbook accuracy born from thousands of hours of range time that everyone assumed was wasted on a medic. "Rooftop secure," she called into her radio, breathing hard. "Extraction zone is clear." The helicopter touched down 30 seconds later, its rotors creating a sandstorm that stung every exposed inch of skin. The breach team moved Patterson's stretcher aboard first, then climbed in themselves, exhausted and bleeding from minor wounds. Isla was last aboard, collapsing into a seat as the helicopter lifted off. She could see the compound falling away below them, smoke still rising from the collapsed building, more hostiles emerging from other structures to fire uselessly at the departing aircraft. Patterson reached out and grabbed her hand, his grip weak but sincere. "You're completely insane," he said, managing a pained smile. "But thank you." Isla squeezed back gently, careful of his foreline. "Save your thanks for when you're out of surgery." The flight back to base took 20 minutes. Isla spent it monitoring Patterson's vitals, administering additional fluids, and preparing him for the immediate surgical intervention he'd need. Around her, the other operators sat in exhausted silence, occasionally glancing at her with expressions that mixed respect, confusion, and something that might have been embarrassment. Reeves finally spoke over the helicopter's noise. "You ran 8 kilometers in 30 minutes, breached a hostile position, collapsed a building, and cleared a rooftop. With an 80-pound medical pack." 78 pounds, Isla corrected absently, checking Patterson's pupils for neurological response. "I reorganized my supplies last week." "That's not the point," Kim said. "The point is, we were wrong about you. Completely wrong." Isla looked up, meeting his eyes. "Yes. You were." Commander Thornton was waiting on the landing pad when they touched down, his face unreadable. A surgical team immediately took custody of Patterson, whisking him away to the medical facility where Dr. Laurent was already scrubbed in and waiting. As the helicopter's rotors wound down, Thornton approached Isla. She stood at attention, ready for whatever consequences her insubordination would bring. "Report to my office," he said simply. 1 hour. Isla spent the hour in the shower, scrubbing away desert sand and cordite residue while her mind replayed every decision she'd made. The water ran rust-colored around her feet, a mixture of dust and other people's blood. Her body ached in ways that would hurt worse tomorrow, but the physical pain was manageable. The consequences of her actions were less certain. She dressed in a fresh uniform, her movements mechanical from exhaustion. Dr. Laurent found her in the medical bay, where she was compulsively reorganizing supplies that were already perfectly organized. "Patterson's out of surgery," he said, leaning against the doorframe. The bullet nicked his spleen, but we got to him in time. He'll make a full recovery. Laurent paused, studying her. You saved his life, you know. Another 20 minutes and the internal bleeding would have been catastrophic. I did my job, Isla replied, not looking up from the medication inventory she was conducting for no reason except to keep her hands busy. You did considerably more than your job. Laurent stepped closer, his voice gentle. You also violated direct orders, engaged in combat operations outside your specialty, and made tactical decisions that could have gotten people killed. I'm aware, sir. The question, Laurent continued, is whether you'd do it again. Isla finally looked at him, her green eyes hard with conviction. Every single time. If the choice is between following orders and saving lives, I'll choose lives. Always. Laurent smiled slightly. Good. That's the right answer, even if it's going to make the next hour very uncomfortable for you. Commander Thornton's office was sparse and functional, decorated only with unit insignias and a single photograph of his family. He sat behind his desk as Isla entered and stood at attention, her face carefully neutral. At ease, Martin, Thornton said, though his tone suggested she should remain anything but relaxed. Do you understand the severity of what you've done? Yes, sir. You disobeyed a direct order. You abandoned your assigned position. You engaged in combat operations without authorization. You made tactical decisions that put yourself and potentially your team at significant risk. Thornton's voice was measured, professional, and completely devoid of warmth. Any one of those infractions would be grounds for disciplinary action. Combined, they constitute a clear violation of military protocol. Yes, sir. I understand, sir. Thornton studied her for a long moment. What I don't understand is why. You've been an exemplary soldier for 11 months. Perfect conduct record, exceptional performance reviews, never a hint of insubordination. Then tonight you threw all of that away. Why? Isla had been preparing for this question during the helicopter ride back. She could give the safe answer, the one about split-second decisions in combat situations. She could claim temporary judgment impairment from stress. She could apologize and hope for leniency. Instead, she told the truth. Because I was tired of being invisible, sir. Tired of being the soldier everyone relies on but nobody trusts. Tired of watching people die or nearly die because the most qualified medic in this unit was left at base camp counting bandages. Her voice was steady, professional, but carried an edge of steel. Patterson was bleeding out 8 kilometers away, and I had the skills to save him. Following orders meant watching him die. Breaking orders meant giving him a chance to live. That's not a difficult choice, sir. The military depends on following orders, Thornton said sharply. Without that discipline, we have chaos. The military also depends on soldiers who can think independently when situations deteriorate beyond the plan's parameters, Isla countered. Sir, with respect, tonight's mission went sideways because we didn't bring adequate medical support into a hostile environment. That was a planning failure, not a discipline issue. Thornton's jaw tightened. For a moment, Isla thought she'd pushed too far. Then, unexpectedly, his expression shifted to something that might have been grudging respect. You're right, he said quietly. The mission planning was inadequate. We assumed everything would proceed smoothly, and we paid for that assumption with Patterson's blood. He leaned back in his chair. But that doesn't excuse your insubordination. I'm not asking for it to be excused, sir. I'm asking for it to be understood. Thornton opened a folder on his desk, scanning documents that Isla couldn't read from her position. The silence stretched uncomfortably long before he spoke again. I've received 3 reports about tonight's operation. Operator Kim states that your tactical assessment of the compound was more accurate than our intelligence briefing. Operator Reeves admits, and I quote, Martin demonstrated combat capabilities that exceeded expectations and proved essential to mission success. Even Patterson, from his hospital bed, has submitted a statement recommending you for commendation rather than court-martial. Isla blinked, genuinely surprised. Sir, I'm not finished. Thornton closed the folder. I've also received a very pointed communication from Dr. Laurent, who suggests that my continued refusal to properly utilize your capabilities constitutes a waste of military resources and potentially endangers lives. He's not wrong. He stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the base. Do you know why I kept assigning you to support roles, Martin? Because I'm small, sir. Because I don't fit the physical profile of a Delta operator. No. Thornton turned to face her. Because I was responsible for a soldier who died 3 years ago. She was brilliant, capable, and determined to prove herself in combat. I authorized her for a mission she wasn't ready for, and she was killed in the first 30 seconds of enemy contact. His voice carried old pain. Her name was Lieutenant Saracen, and I promised myself I would never make that mistake again. Understanding dawned on Isla. So you were protecting me. I was protecting myself from making another catastrophic judgment call, Thornton admitted. I saw your capabilities, Martin. I read your test scores, watched your training performance, recognized your potential. And I was terrified that if I put you in the field, you'd become another name I'd carry for the rest of my career. Isla absorbed this, recalculating everything she'd assumed about Thornton's motivations. Sir, with respect, holding me back didn't protect anyone. It just delayed the inevitable situation where my skills would be necessary regardless of your approval. Clearly. Thornton returned to his desk, his expression hardening back into professional distance. Which brings us to your consequences. You violated direct orders during combat operations. That cannot be ignored or excused, regardless of the outcome. Isla straightened her spine, ready to accept whatever punishment came. I understand, sir. However, Thornton continued, after extensive review of tonight's events in consultation with my command staff, we've determined that your actions, while unauthorized, ultimately served the mission's best interests and likely saved multiple lives. Isla's heart began beating faster, though she kept her expression neutral. Therefore, Thornton said, pulling out another document, you're being officially reprimanded for insubordination. This will appear in your service record. You'll also be required to complete additional training protocols to ensure you're prepared for the roles you've decided to assign yourself. He slid the document across the desk. It wasn't a court-martial order. It was a transfer notification. Effective immediately, you're being reassigned to the Combat Medical Response Unit. You'll receive tactical training, advanced combat certifications, and full integration with operational teams. Thornton's eyes met hers. You'll be exactly what you proved you already are tonight, a combat medic who can keep pace with Delta operators in hostile environments. Isla stared at the document, barely processing the words. Not punishment. Promotion. Recognition. Sir, thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet, Thornton said, a slight smile appearing. The training you're about to undergo will make tonight's 8-kilometer run look like a leisurely stroll. You'll be pushed harder than you've ever been pushed, tested in ways that will make you question whether this is what you really want. I've never questioned what I want, sir. Then prove it. Show me that tonight wasn't a reckless gesture but a demonstration of capabilities that can be consistently replicated under controlled conditions. Thornton extended his hand. Welcome to the team, Martin. The real team. Isla shook his hand, feeling the weight of 11 months of frustration lifting. I won't let you down, sir. I know you won't. Dismissed. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative. 6 months later, Isla stood in the same briefing room where she'd once been relegated to equipment manifests and ignored suggestions. But everything had transformed. The Combat Medical Response Unit patch on her shoulder carried weight that her logistics insignia never had, and when she spoke during tactical planning sessions, people leaned forward to listen. The terrain in Sector 9 presents significant challenges, she told the assembled team, pointing to the topographical display projected on the wall. But the approach from the western ridge offers optimal cover and reduces exposure time by approximately 40%. Lieutenant Hayes nodded, making notes on his tactical pad. He was new to the unit, transferred in 3 months ago, and had quickly learned that underestimating Isla Martin was a mistake made only once. What about casualty extraction if we encounter resistance? I've identified 3 primary evac routes with secondary alternatives for each. Isla highlighted the paths on the map. Medical staging points here, here, and here. Response time from any position in the operational zone is under 8 minutes. Commander Thornton, observing from the back of the room, allowed himself a small smile. The soldier who'd once violated his orders to prove herself had become his most reliable tactical asset. Her unique combination of medical expertise and combat capability had changed how the entire unit approached mission planning. Questions? Isla asked the assembled operators. Operator Reeves raised his hand. Martin, you'll be carrying the advanced medical kit on this one. That's 95 pounds with the new trauma equipment. You confident about maintaining pace over that terrain? It was a fair question, asked without the dismissive tone that would have accompanied it a year ago. Reeves had learned to respect Isla's capabilities the hard way, by watching her outperform his expectations repeatedly during training exercises. I've been training with 110 pounds, Isla replied. 95 is manageable. Show off, someone muttered good-naturedly from the back, drawing scattered laughter. The mission launched at dawn, a precision extraction of intelligence assets from a compromised safe house near the Turkish border. Isla moved with the team through rocky terrain that would have devastated most soldiers, her medical pack sitting comfortably on her frame through months of brutal conditioning. The safe house appeared abandoned when they arrived, which immediately set off alarm bells. Patterson, now fully recovered and back to leading missions, signaled for cautious approach. Isla took position covering the eastern approach while the breach team prepared entry. Something's wrong, she whispered into her radio. The dust patterns around the entrance show recent disturbance, but there's no defensive positioning. This feels like... The explosion cut off her words. Not from the safe house, but from behind them. A secondary position they hadn't identified opened fire, and suddenly the team was caught in a kill box with hostile forces on 3 sides. Ambush. Patterson's voice was urgent. Fall back to rally point Beta. But Operator Hayes went down before they could move, his leg shattered by a round that caught him mid-stride. He screamed, a sound that cut through the chaos, and Isla was moving before conscious thought engaged. She sprinted across 15 meters of exposed ground, sliding into cover next to Hayes while bullets chewed up the dirt around them. His femur was shattered, the bone visible through torn flesh, blood pumping in arterial spurts that meant he had minutes, not hours. I've got you, Isla said, her voice calm despite the firefight raging around them. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, tourniquet above the wound, hemostatic agent packed into the injury, pressure dressing secured with swift wraps. Hayes was screaming, but she tuned it out, focusing entirely on the mechanical process of preventing his death. Martin, you're exposed. Kim's voice carried over the gunfire. We need to move. Not until he's stable. Isla worked faster, her training allowing her to operate at maximum efficiency even under fire. The tourniquet stopped the arterial bleeding. The packing controlled the wound. Hayes' screaming subsided to pained gasps as shock began setting in. Can you move him? Patterson called. Isla assessed quickly. Hayes was 6 feet tall and probably 200 pounds. She was 5'3" and barely broke 120. By every conventional measure, carrying him was impossible. And you've accomplished more in combat medicine at 23 than most professionals achieve in entire careers. Lauron smiled. Age is irrelevant when you're redefining how an entire specialty functions. The question is whether you're interested. Isla thought about it. Teaching meant fewer operational missions, but it also meant spreading her knowledge to others, creating more combat medics who could operate at her level. It meant turning her individual capabilities into institutional change. I'm interested, she said finally. But I want to maintain operational status. I won't just be an instructor. I wouldn't expect anything else from you, Laurent replied. Part 9. 3 months later, Isla stood before a classroom of 30 combat medics who'd been selected for the new Advanced Combat Medical Response course. They ranged from fresh recruits to experienced operators, all of them looking at her with expressions mixing curiosity and skepticism. She recognized that skepticism. It was the same look she'd received for years, the doubt that someone her size could possibly teach them anything valuable about operating in hostile environments. My name is Sergeant Isla Martin, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the room. I'm 5 feet 3 inches tall, I weigh 117 pounds, and I've completed 43 combat missions with a 100% survival rate for casualties under my care. If you're looking at me and thinking I can't possibly teach you anything useful, you're already failing this course. A few students shifted uncomfortably. One raised his hand, a large operator named Davis who looked like he'd been carved from granite. Sergeant, with respect, how do you expect us to replicate your techniques when most of us have completely different physical builds? It was a fair question, and Isla had prepared for it. You don't replicate my techniques exactly, she replied. You adapt the principles to your own capabilities. I carry casualties using leverage and core strength because I lack upper body mass. You might use different techniques that leverage your strengths. The point isn't to make you into smaller versions of yourselves. It's to make you think beyond conventional limitations. She pulled up a tactical scenario on the display screen. Combat medicine isn't just about treating injuries. It's about preventing them through superior planning, anticipating needs before crises develop, and operating as both medic and tactical asset. That's what this course teaches. The training was brutal. Isla pushed her students through scenarios that combined medical emergencies with tactical complications, treating casualties under fire, performing emergency procedures in confined spaces, carrying wounded soldiers across hostile terrain while maintaining defensive awareness. She was demanding, uncompromising, and absolutely refused to accept excuses. If someone claimed a task was impossible due to their physical limitations, she demonstrated it herself, then made them repeat it until they succeeded. Davis became one of her most challenging students, constantly questioning whether her methods were practical for larger operators. During a particularly difficult exercise involving casualty extraction from a collapsed building, he finally confronted her directly. Sergeant, this is insane. You're asking me to navigate through spaces that are barely wide enough for someone your size. How is this supposed to help me in real operations? Isla studied him for a moment. Davis, what's your biggest operational concern? Getting stuck in confined spaces during building clearances, he admitted. I'm 6'4" and 240. Tight quarters are my nightmare. Exactly. So instead of avoiding scenarios that challenge your weaknesses, we're training you to operate in them. Isla pointed to the training structure. Real combat doesn't care about your comfort zone. It puts you in the worst possible situations and demands you adapt. That's why I'm teaching adaptation under adversity. Something clicked in Davis's expression. He nodded slowly, then returned to the exercise with renewed determination. By the end of the day, he'd successfully navigated the structure 3 times, each run faster than the last. After training ended, Davis approached Isla as she was reviewing performance metrics. Sergeant, I owe you an apology. I spent the first week of this course assuming you were unqualified to teach us. I was wrong. You weren't wrong to question, Isla replied. You were wrong to let those questions prevent you from learning. There's a difference. How do you do it? Davis asked. Carry casualties that outweigh you by 80 pounds? Maintain combat effectiveness with equipment loads that should be impossible for your frame? Operate at a level that most operators twice your size can't match? Isla considered the question. I refuse to accept other people's definitions of what I'm capable of. Everyone told me I was too small for Delta Force operations. Too weak for combat medicine in hostile environments. Too limited to be effective under fire. I decided they were wrong, then spent every day proving it. But there are physical limitations, Davis pressed. Physics doesn't care about determination. True, Isla acknowledged. But physics also rewards efficiency. Leverage beats raw strength. Technique beats size. Intelligence beats muscle. I can't change my physical build, so I optimized everything else until my limitations became irrelevant. She pulled up Davis's performance data. You've improved significantly this week. Your casualty extraction times are down 30%. Your medical procedures are faster and more precise. You're learning to use your size as an advantage rather than viewing it as your only tool. Davis studied the data, clearly surprised by his own improvement. I didn't realize I'd progressed that much. That's because you stopped comparing yourself to me and started comparing yourself to your previous performance, Isla explained. The point isn't to become me. It's to become the best version of yourself. The training course concluded 6 weeks later with a comprehensive field exercise that combined everything the students had learned. 6 months into commanding the Combat Medical Response Unit, Isla received a mission request that made even her pause. A reconnaissance team had gone missing in the Sahara Desert during a sandstorm. Their last known position was 70 kilometers from the nearest base, in terrain so hostile that conventional search and rescue had been deemed too dangerous. The mission briefing laid out the grim reality: temperatures exceeding 50 degrees Celsius during the day, plummeting to near freezing at night, 0 water sources, and hostile forces operating in the region. The missing team had been out of contact for 36 hours. Command assessment is that survival probability is less than 20%, the intelligence officer explained, his tone suggesting he expected Isla to decline the mission. Even if we locate them, extraction under these conditions presents extreme risk to rescue personnel. Isla studied the terrain maps with the same intensity she brought to every impossible situation throughout her career. The Sahara wasn't the Afghan mountains or Syrian borderlands, but the principles remained the same: understand the environment, adapt to its challenges, and refuse to accept that soldiers had to be abandoned because conditions were difficult. "We're going," she said simply. "Prep for insertion at dawn." Her team assembled with the practiced efficiency of soldiers who'd trained together for months. Davis checked equipment loads. Thompson verified medical supplies. Rodriguez confirmed communication protocols. These weren't just medics anymore, they were a specialized unit capable of operating in conditions that would break conventional forces. "Boss, this one's different," Davis said quietly as they prepared for departure. "The Sahara doesn't care how determined you are. Heat exhaustion, dehydration, disorientation, these aren't enemies you can outthink. My grandfather survived 3 days in the Scottish Highlands during a blizzard when he was 16, Isla replied, securing her pack. He taught me that survival isn't about avoiding nature's dangers. It's about respecting them while refusing to let them define your limitations." The helicopter dropped them at first light, 20 kilometers from the reconnaissance team's last known position. The heat was already building, the sun transforming the desert into a furnace that would only intensify throughout the day. Isla established their search pattern based on survival psychology and terrain analysis. Lost personnel tended to follow certain patterns, seeking shade, following perceived paths, moving toward anything that resembled civilization. She'd studied desert survival extensively, understanding that finding the missing team required thinking like them. "We move in 2-person teams," she instructed. "Maintain hydration discipline, small sips every 15 minutes. Watch each other for heat exhaustion symptoms. If anyone shows signs of impaired judgment, we pull back immediately." They spread out across the search grid, moving through landscape that looked identical in every direction. Sand dunes stretched to the horizon, broken only by occasional rock formations that provided minimal shade. The heat was oppressive, the kind that made breathing feel like inhaling fire. 3 hours into the search, Rodriguez radioed in. "Lieutenant, I've got tracks. Multiple personnel, heading northeast. They're recent." Isla redirected the team to Rodriguez's position. The tracks were indeed fresh, probably made within the last 12 hours. But they were erratic, weaving between dunes without clear purpose, a sign of disorientation from dehydration or heat exposure. "They're not thinking clearly," Thompson observed, studying the pattern. "These tracks show progressive cognitive impairment. They're in serious trouble." Isla followed the tracks with growing urgency. Every hour the reconnaissance team spent in this heat reduced their survival probability. She pushed the pace harder, drawing on reserves of endurance built through years of refusing to accept her physical limitations. 4 hours in, Davis spotted something ahead, a cluster of rock formations that provided partial shade. As they approached, Isla saw them. 3 soldiers collapsed in the rock's shadow, barely conscious, their uniforms crusted with salt from extreme dehydration. "Medical emergency," she called, already moving. Her team responded instantly, each member executing their role with practiced precision. For lines established, fluid resuscitation initiated, core temperatures assessed and managed. The reconnaissance team leader was semi-conscious, his lips cracked and bleeding from dehydration. Isla worked on him personally, establishing access and beginning aggressive rehydration while monitoring for complications. "You came," he rasped, his voice barely audible. Command said, "Too dangerous." Command was wrong, Isla replied, adjusting his flow rate. "Happens more often than they'd like to admit." Stabilizing the patients took 40 minutes, time they didn't have in the building heat. The afternoon temperatures were approaching lethal levels, and they still needed to reach the extraction point 8 kilometers away. "We can't carry 3 casualties that distance in this heat," Davis said, voicing the tactical reality everyone was thinking. "We'll all be heat casualties before we make it halfway." Isla was already calculating alternatives, her mind working through scenarios with the same analytical precision she applied to every impossible problem. The solution crystallized with sudden clarity. "We don't carry them the whole way," she said. "We use relay positions." The relay system was brutally simple: establish shaded positions at 2-kilometer intervals, move casualties between positions and stages, and allow team members to recover between carries. It meant slower progress, but it also meant everyone survived. Isla organized the relay points with precise efficiency, using her understanding of terrain and survival physiology to maximize their limited resources. Each position was marked, communication protocols established, and responsibilities clearly assigned. The first leg was agony. Moving 3 semi-conscious casualties across 2 kilometers of desert while the sun hammered down required every ounce of strength her team possessed. But they reached the first relay point, rested in the shade, rehydrated, and prepared for the next stage. "This is insane," one of the rescued soldiers muttered, gradually regaining consciousness. "You're risking your entire team for us." "That's what we do," Isla replied, checking his vitals. "We don't leave people behind because the situation is difficult." The second leg was worse. The heat peaked at 53 degrees Celsius, and even with relay positions, the exertion was pushing everyone toward heat exhaustion. Isla monitored her team constantly, forcing hydration breaks and watching for symptoms that signaled impending collapse. Davis stumbled during the third leg, his normally steady gait becoming uncoordinated. Isla immediately called a halt, pulling him into shade and checking his core temperature. He was borderline hyperthermia, another 30 minutes and he'd be a casualty himself. "I'm fine," Davis protested, though his flushed face and rapid breathing contradicted him. "You're relieved for this leg," Isla ordered. "Rodriguez takes your position." No arguments. Davis wanted to protest but recognized the same uncompromising determination that had characterized Isla's entire career. When she made medical decisions, they weren't suggestions. The fourth and final leg brought them to the extraction point just as the helicopter arrived. The rescued reconnaissance team was stable, her own team was exhausted but functional, and once again, Isla had proven that impossible was just another word for difficult. On the flight back, the reconnaissance team leader sought her out. "Lieutenant Martin, I've been in special operations for 12 years. I've worked with the best rescue teams in the world. What you just did, that was beyond anything I've seen." "We got lucky with the timing," Isla replied, deflecting the praise. Another 6 hours and the outcome might have been different. It wasn't luck. It was expertise, planning, and absolute refusal to quit. He paused. I heard about you. The medic who was too small for field operations. Who violated orders to save lives. Who built an entire program because conventional wisdom said it couldn't be done. Isla smiled slightly. Conventional wisdom says a lot of things. I've made it my career to prove it wrong. Back at base, Commander Thornton was waiting on the landing pad, not unusual, but his expression suggested this wasn't a routine debriefing. As the team disembarked and the rescued soldiers were transferred to medical care, he approached Isla with a folder. Exceptional work, as always, he said, then handed her the folder. But there's something you need to see. Inside was a commendation, not just a unit citation, but a personal decoration for valor. More significantly, there was a promotion order and a transfer notification. They want you at Special Operations Command, Thornton explained. Developing combat medical programs at the institutional level. Your methods are being adopted across every branch of special operations. They want the architect of those methods helping implement them globally. Isla read the orders carefully. It was a significant promotion, prestigious assignment, and recognition that her work had fundamentally changed how military medicine functioned. It was also a desk job that would take her out of operational status. Sir, with respect, I appreciate the recognition. But I'm a combat medic, not an administrator. Thornton smiled, as if he'd expected exactly this response. I told them you'd say that. So they've created a compromise, operational command of all combat medical response units with responsibility for program development. You'd deploy on high-risk missions while also shaping the broader institutional approach. Isla considered this carefully. It meant expanding her impact beyond a single unit, creating systematic change that would save lives for years to come. But it also meant maintaining the operational role that defined who she was. I accept, she said finally. On one condition. Thornton laughed. You're still negotiating? Always, Isla replied. I want Davis promoted to lead my current unit. He's ready, and he understands the principles we've built. Already approved, Thornton said. He's been your second for months. Everyone knew he'd take over when you moved up. That evening, Isla stood at the edge of FOB Viper, watching the sun set over the desert that had almost killed her team earlier that day. She thought about the journey from overlooked logistics specialist to commander of revolutionary medical programs, every obstacle, every person who doubted her, every impossible mission that became routine through determination and skill. Her grandfather's words echoed in her memory, fear is just noise, lass. And noise can't kill you. He'd been right. The real dangers were giving up, accepting limitations, and believing other people's definitions of what was possible. Everything else was just noise. Isla smiled, secured her gear, and walked back toward the operations center. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new people to save, and new opportunities to prove that impossible was just another word for not yet accomplished. After all, they'd tried to break her by leaving her in the desert with nothing. Instead, they'd discovered that Delta Force didn't fear death. It feared wasting potential. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.